And now it's time for Global Insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs. It's been almost a month since Russia launched its recent invasion of Ukraine, as well as the tragic human cost the conflict and resulting geopolitical turmoil also have grave economic consequences, and these are rippling around the world. The crushing sanctions the U.S. and Europe have slapped on Russia have certainly dealt a blow to Russia's economy, but there's also blowback on the countries imposing them. It should also go without saying that the Ukrainian and Russian economies are being hit the hardest by the supply shock, energy independence measures, the refugee crisis, and countless other related repercussions are being felt around the world. For more, we connect to Claus VISTESEN, Chief Eurozone Economist at Pantheon Macroeconomics, who's joining us from London, and Yang Jun-sok, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea from Seoul. Thank you both for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Happy to be here. Sure.
Thank you. Now let's start with Mr. VISTESEN. The economic consequences of the war are most certainly not confined to the countries fighting it. So what do you think the extent of the damage will be, and how can countries limit this impact?
Well, the damage that's being done from the war, in some sense, exacerbates trends that were already underway. So you can think about the war in Ukraine as a negative supply shock, right? So we have energy prices, commodity prices going up. These prices were already high to begin with. The war also is making the supply shock in manufacturing worse. That was already a problem to begin with. So in some sense, this is happening at a very unfortunate time. I mean, in some sense, war always is at an unfortunate time, but specifically for the European economy, it's making an inflation problem even worse and also exacerbating a supply shock in manufacturing and goods producing sectors.
Now, speaking of inflation, Professor Yang, experts have warned the conflict will trigger higher inflation as well as lowering growth and disrupting supply chains. In your view, which of the economic repercussions will be felt most acutely around the world?
Well, I think it's definitely inflation, and that's because while Russia takes maybe about 3% of the global economy and Ukraine much less, what they produce and what they export is the rawest of the raw materials, grain and energy. And that affects basically every price down the production line. And that's why it's so crucial. This war has been proven so crucial for Russia. Russia and Ukraine is a major producer of wheat, and also Russia is a major exporter of oil. Oil may be made up if OPEC decides that they can afford to produce more. Grain, I'm not sure if they can afford, other global suppliers can make up the difference. So when the grain prices go up, it's not just the price of grain, but it's also the price of meat and other foods. And Russia is a major producer of fertilizer, so almost all agricultural goods are likely to be affected, and that's probably going to be as bad for inflation as oil.
So this war really has to end because it's really affecting our daily lives as well. But Mr. VISTESEN, do you foresee increased supply chain disruptions in Europe and in the U.S. as a result of the war in Ukraine?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think we're only now seeing the beginning of that. I mean, again, it's always a little bit difficult to predict exactly how these things are going to play out, because also, as the professor said, it takes a little bit of time for this to ripple out through the production chains and lines, but surely we're going to see manufacturing in Europe being affected by this. Input prices are increasing at a very rapid rate. That's going to compress margins and going to cut production. Similar in the US. Also, just the fact that energy prices is going up at the rate they're going up means that, of course, petrol prices, airfares, things like that, it could be more expensive. So yeah, I think we're now in for a sort of a second supply side shock. COVID, in some sense, was the first, and that's almost now over, and now we're getting a second one. So yeah, I mean, we are going to see a further supply side shock, higher inflation, lower real income. So yeah, an adverse shock to the economy for sure.
Now, staying with you, Mr. VISTESEN, do you expect European markets to shoulder the majority of the financial losses? And if so, which sectors are going to be hit the hardest?
Yeah, I mean, so the European financial markets obviously are closest to this crisis. So yes, you mean in some sense to paraphrase, they will fall the most or take the largest hit. I think we should especially look for weakness in sectors such as industrial chemicals that are very reliant on the kind of inputs that are now increasing in price. But generally, I mean, global markets obviously are going to be affected by this. But yes, European markets, especially markets which are very reliant on Russian energy. So the German market, for example, is a classic one. Especially the German industrial market is a sector that's going to be affected by this.
Now, Professor Yang, you just touched upon this a while ago, but many countries, including South Korea, were dealing with rising inflation even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So do you think price rises are going to become even uglier in the months to come?
At least for the next few months, definitely. And that is because the oil prices are likely to rise in the short run, and grain and food prices are likely to rise continually in the medium term as well. As I said, I think oil price, you do have some chances that it will fall or at least level off if the OPEC countries do decide to produce more, and if the U.S. Keeps on raising its interest rate, so the demand is curtailed, then we may see some leveling off of oil prices. But grain prices, I think, will be tougher to control because, well, it takes just longer time for additional grain to come into line. And remember, most of the grain is used as feed for animals throughout the world, so it'll probably impact not only on just grain, but also other food prices, and that will bleed into processed food prices as well globally.
Now, let's shift a little bit to energy. So, Mr. Vistesen, many countries have already started or are pledging to reduce energy reliance on Russia. However, Russia has tremendous leverage over Europe when it comes to energy. So, how steadfast do you think these bans will be, and what will happen if Russia and Ukraine kind of negotiate a peace deal in the coming days or weeks?
Well, so if we start with the first bit of that, I mean, obviously, it's very difficult for Europe just to turn off the gas or oil from Russia. I mean, it's a political decision, and if they did it, of course, that would be, I think the European economy would probably be pushed into recession in the very short run. But it's very important to understand that Europe cannot, in the short run, replace the gas, especially the gas that it gets from Russia. I mean, Norway is already producing at full tilt. They can't go to Qatar, which is tied into long-term contracts with China already. US is producing a lot, but it's not enough. So that would, again, to your point, be a political decision. It's very uncertain at this point, I think, whether European politicians are willing or are going to take this step. Germany seems reluctant because Germany is very dependent on this. So the way you should understand it, it's not as if the politicians don't want to or don't think they might be the right decision, but economically, it's a very difficult decision to make because Europe cannot quickly just go out and buy gas elsewhere. It's simply not possible.
Well, the next question goes to both of you, but first, Professor Yang, were you surprised by the West's willingness to sanction Russia to the extent they did? And expanding on that, do you also think Putin was caught off guard?
I think everybody expected sanctions. Russia was preparing for sanctions. One thing that caught, I think, both me and President Putin by surprise was freezing of the central bank assets. That basically turned Russia from having a very large foreign reserve into a country which had very little foreign reserve. So now they're facing a default. They're facing what is very similar to a beginning of a currency crisis where the value of the ruble has fallen and they're still suffering shortage of hard currency. And I think that definitely caught not just myself, but the Russian authorities by surprise. Otherwise, they would have kept more of that money in Russia if they could. So that was a big surprise. And again, this kind of measure was only used in, say, Libya or Iran. So that, I think, shows how much the United States authorities and European authorities are taking the invasion.
Well, what about you, Mr. Vistesen? Were you surprised? What is your stance on this?
No, I completely agree with the professor. I mean, I think it was the speed with which sanctions have been imposed, I think has been surprising. The nature of the sanctions have been surprising, especially, again, I agree, the FX reserve freezing has been surprising. And yeah, I also think Mr. Putin probably did not expect the US and Europe to move this quickly. Of course, there are still sanctions that can be used, especially in the energy market, but yeah, I mean the speed and severity of the sanctions I think has been a surprise. But then again, the invasion itself maybe was a surprise. I mean, people expected Putin to do something, but not to invade the whole country. So here we are. That's why the West probably has responded in a way that it considers to be commensurate with what has happened. So.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of the West's reaction to this, Professor Yang, the Biden administration has warned China of, quote, consequences if Beijing materially supports Russia in its war against Ukraine. And Beijing has yet to condemn Moscow for its actions. So do you think China is supporting Russia financially? And what consequences, if they would, the U.S. slap on China if it can be shown that Beijing is actually helping Russia out?
Well, I don't think there's any indication right now that China is actively supporting Russia. I think what they want to do is remain more or less neutral. So they may allow Russia to passively use the Chinese financial transaction network reserves that Russia is keeping in Chinese yuan in their central banks. But I don't think they will actively support Russia by giving them money or weapons. Now, part of the reason I think has to do with international relations. Part of the reason why the U.S. and the other Western countries are showing such a strong response is to warn China that if you ever do this with Taiwan or some of the other areas in South China Sea, Western countries can come down really hard on them. But also, China wants to get rid of Trump tariffs in the United States, and if they support Russia, then getting rid of those tariffs will be much harder, and it may even induce the United States to raise the tariffs even further. But also, they don't want to anger Russia too much because, well, Russia and China shares borders, and President Xi and President Putin do recognize that if they were to stand off against Western countries, they're going to have to do it together.
Well, what about you, Mr. Vistesen? What do you think of the chances of the U.S. sanctioning China, and what do you think could be some of the consequences they could impose?
Well, at this point, I don't think there's much chance of the U.S. sanctioning China because, again, I agree with the professor. I don't think there's any clear indication here that China is outright supporting Russia either via sort of direct financial aid or weapons or anything like that. So it'd be difficult to make that argument. I think China is going to try to sit on the fence here, try to exploit the situation if it can, but do it in a way so that it avoids a sort of a direct sanction confrontation with the West, because China at this point has no interest in a confrontation like that. And this is the case even if you believe that China in the long run is an adversary to the U.S. That story that might be true, but at this point I don't think China has any interest in outright and overtly supporting Russia at this point to such a way as to invite sanctions. So. I perceive China sitting on the fence. I don't think the U.S. is going to be in a situation where they feel they have to impose sanctions on China.
Okay, let's hope that could be the situation. Now, I'm afraid it's now time to wrap our discussion. Thank you so much for making time for us, Mr. Vistesen and Professor Yang. We appreciate your insights.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.